Hello and welcome to the third of three lectures on process capacity. Already we've talked about process flow measurements, the relationship between inventory in the process, flow rates for the process, and time in the process. We also introduced Little's Law and showed how that could be used to examine performance issues in a process environment. In the second lecture, we introduced queuing theory, the idea being that when there's randomness in arrivals and when there's randomness in service times, performance of the system is going to be affected dramatically as the utilization of the resources increase. In this third lecture, we're going to focus on the theory of constraints. We're going to build up to it by taking a more in-depth view of process capacity, specifically how resource and resource pools determine the theoretical capacity for a process. We'll also discuss throughput and capacity utilization and describe how differences in the product mix can affect process capacity. Once we've set up that background, then we'll introduce the theory of constraints formally. Okay, let's start our discussion talking about resource and resource pools. The first thing I want to talk about is the difference between steps in a process and the resources required to carry out the work. For instance, if you think about the steps in the process, imagine a flow chart with boxes connected by arrows. Each of those steps represented by the boxes contains some work that has to be done. However, there may be multiple steps and only a limited number of resources to carry them out, or vice versa. An example would be, for instance, if you have two drive-in windows at a fast food restaurant, but they're manned by one individual. In that case, the number of individuals we have manning those different process steps is going to have an impact on the effective capacity of the process. Now, in very simple systems, we assume that the resources are assigned to a process step. But more realistically, resources can be pooled and shared across process steps as needed. In fact, that's what a lot of businesses do this day. They may have processes defined by specific steps, but they keep the resources pooled and pull them out to handle process steps as needed. And you hear a lot about that in terms of the flexibility of a resource pool and how it makes it more efficient and effective for a system to work with that kind of a situation. Okay, so let's be specific about theoretical capacity. If we're looking at a specific resource unit, like a person, for instance, we might talk about that person or that machine's maximum sustainable flow rate if it is fully utilized. That is, if Bob is working 8 hours a day with no breaks, how much work can he do over that 8-hour day? Now, the difference between a resource unit and a resource pool is the resource pool is the sum of the theoretical capacity of all units in the pool. So again, if we're talking about a machine that's capable of producing 1,000 units a day, if there's 8 machines in the resource pool, then the theoretical capacity of the resource pool is 8,000. Now, that's fine if we're looking at the resource unit or resource pool level. But if we're talking about a process and we're talking about the theoretical capacity of a process, a lot's going to depend on the flow of work through the different steps, to what extent they utilize the resource pools. So the lowest theoretical capacity of all resource pools is going to define the process theoretical capacity. Now, this is something that we need to show via an example. So we'll do that in the next slide. This is an example I took from the book Managing Business Process Flows by Anna Pindi and several other authors. We're talking here about physicians' claims being processed at New Life Financial. So when we look at what has to take place, let's look at this column right here. Each physician claim that comes in takes 0.6 minutes of mailroom clerk time. It takes 4.2 minutes of data entry clerk time, 6.6 minutes of claims processor time, and 2.2 minutes of claims supervisor time. So that's the load that each claim puts against the different resources. We actually, though, have 4 resource pools here. In the case of the mailroom clerk, we have one person, so if they work 450 minutes per day, the available minutes per day is 450. Okay, so if I have 450 minutes of mailroom clerk time per day, and the unit load is zero point 0.6, then what's the theoretical capacity of the resource pool per minute? It turns out to be 1.67. Now, how did we get that? Well, we have one mailroom clerk in our resource pool. It takes them 0.6 minutes to handle a physician's claim, so the theoretical capacity of the resource pool is 1.67. In this case, we have one resource unit and the pool consists of one resource. Now, make sure you understand all these lines here. After you do that, let's look at the data entry clerk. Each data entry clerk works 450 minutes per day. The number of units in the resource pool is 8, so the available minutes per day for data entry clerk is 3,600 minutes. The unit load per physician's claim is 4.2. So with regard to the theoretical capacity of the resource pool, we have 8 of them. They can handle a physician load in 4.2 minutes each. So in theory, this resource pool should be able to handle 1.9 physician's claims per minute. So make sure you understand that math for a second here. Okay, same thing for the claims supervisors. We have 12 in the resource pool. The unit load for a physician claim is 6.6 minutes. So these 12 people together can handle 1.82 physician's claims per minute. Okay. So again, take a couple minutes to make sure you understand the difference between a resource unit, the resource pool, the available minutes per day for the resource pool, and the theoretical capacity of the resource pool, in this case on a per minute basis. Now, looking at the theoretical capacity of the resource pools on a per minute basis is okay, but really what we want to know is what does it look like on a per day basis? So this may be more intuitive to you. Let's start with the mailroom clerk. The mailroom clerk again works 450 minutes per day. There's only one of them, so the available minutes per day of mailroom clerk time is 450. If each physician's claim takes 0.6 minutes, then over the course of the day, if the mailroom clerk was kept busy 100% of the time, they could handle 750 claims. Similarly, if the data entry clerks, all 8 of them, were working, they'd be working 3,600 hours a day, and 3,600 minutes per day. And 3,600 minutes per day divided by the physician claim load of 4.2 minutes of data entry clerk time means that the theoretical capacity of the resource pool here is 857.14. Now, if you look at these theoretical capacities of the resource pools, you'll notice one is smaller than the others, and that's the claims supervisor. We have 5 people working in claims supervising, but they're only working for 240 minutes a day. So the total available minutes is 1,200. Dividing that by 2.2, we get a theoretical capacity for the pool of 545.45. So if we look at this, the way we describe theoretical capacity of the process is based on this idea. A physician's claim requires resources from each of these pools. Even though the mailroom clerk can do 750 per day, the data entry clerks can do 857, and the claims processors can do 654. The fact is we're limited based on the claims supervisor's theoretical capacity. So the theoretical capacity of the process itself becomes 545.45 units per day. It is constrained by the claims supervisor. Another way to look at it is, even if we had more mailroom clerks, more data entry clerks, more claims processors, it's not going to affect the capacity of the process because we're limited by what the claims supervisors can do. If we want to expand the capacity of the process, then we're going to need to find some way to expand the available minutes per day for the claims supervisor, either by having more folks working there or having them work more minutes. Now, there's a general truism about process capacity. That is, there's going to be at least one constraint. The only way we could have an unconstrained process is if we had infinite capacity in each resource pool, which is never going to happen. Now I need at least one constraint, but it's conceivable I could have a tie. I could have the math work out, for instance, so that the claims processors and the claims supervisors actually happen to have the same resource pool theoretical capacity. But in any case, they're still going to limit what the theoretical capacity of the process is. Okay, so if that's the case, if we've defined what the theoretical capacity of the resource pools are, what if we're bringing in 480 claims per day? The first question I want to ask you is, go back to the Little's Law discussion we had a couple lectures back. If we look at this with the classic process model, we might argue that the process is currently capable of supporting a flow rate, R, of 545 per day. But in reality, if we're only bringing in 480 per day, what is the achieved flow rate for the process going to be? Well, we can't produce additional claims within the process. That's not the point. So even though our theoretical capacity is 545, in actuality, if we have 480 claims coming in per day, that will be the flow rate out of the process. And we will have what we call a steady state process. All right? So looking at this, if we have our theoretical capacities for the resource pools and we got 480 coming in per day, we can start to calculate what the utilization levels are going to be for the different resource pools. And not surprisingly, the claims supervisor's resource pool is the most highly utilized. So what? This is where we go back and pull in our queuing lecture material. If the claims supervisors is the most highly utilized resource pool, then chances are it's also going to have the longest queue of work in front of it, probably the longest waiting times, etc. It's probably the one resource pool that's in danger on being on the bubble where utilization levels become so high that waiting times become inordinately long in front of that step. So again, just through this example, we're pulling together what we've already talked about across the past couple of lectures. Okay, so far we've talked about the idea that processes consist of resource pools and that the resource pool with the most limited capacity serves as a constraint on the capacity of the entire process. Now what I want to look at is what is the impact if we have differences in product mixes? Because if you go back to this example, a huge part of determining what the theoretical capacity of the resource pools is the unit loads based on physicians' claims. So intuitively, if we start changing the unit load values for physicians' claims, then we're going to change the theoretical capacity of the resource pools and very likely the theoretical capacity of the overall process. So I want to revisit New Life using a spreadsheet called newlife.xls, which is available to you. And first of all, let's start with the idea that physicians' claims generate $10 of revenue. On the other hand, New Life has the option of taking on hospital claims. Hospital claims actually generate 25% more revenue per claim. However, as you can see down here, they have substantially different unit loads. So yes, we're going to generate more revenue per unit of work, but because the hospital claims require more work per unit, it's going to tend to bring down the theoretical capacity of the process. So we have to ask the question, which is better, sticking with physicians' claims or hospital claims, if we have the choice? So here's the questions we have. What would be the theoretical capacity for the entire process if New Life converted to only hospital claims? And then what would the dollar throughput be? Does the constraint move? Okay, so looking at our spreadsheet, first of all, I'm going to review it for the physician's claims. Let's assume for a second that we're simply dealing with physician's claims like we started. So they represent 100% of the product mix, and each claim we handle generates $10 of revenue. So here we have the mailroom clerk again, 450 minutes per day, one in the resource pool, total available minutes is 450. The physician's claims has a unit load of 0.6, and therefore, since the physician's claims are 100% of the workload, then the average unit workload is 0.6 minutes. So the theoretical capacity of the resource pool is 750. Now you'll notice that's what we had before. So we're all good all the way down. And in fact, what you see here is when we have 100% physicians claims, we have theoretical capacities across our resource pools of 750, 857.14, 654.55, and 545.45 for the claim supervisor. So the theoretical capacity of the process is 545. And if we were to run this process at 100% of the process capacity, that means the claim supervisors would be busy 100% of the time, and everyone else would be busy something less than that. So in theory, we could generate up to $5,454 of revenue if we stick with 100% physicians claims. So make sure you understand that and you're comfortable with the math there before we change it. Okay, what happens if we switch the product mix? So now we're 100% hospital claims. Well, what happens? Bottom line, theoretical revenue drops down. Why is that the case? Well, the reason is, even though the unit price or unit revenue goes up to 12.5, the unit load is so much heavier for the hospital claims that it drops the theoretical capacity of the resource pool down to 375. So we've gone from like 545 at $10 per to 375 at $12.50 per, and overall revenues drop. Another way to look at it is if you take the physician's claim revenue of $10 and divide it by the unit load for the constraint of 2.2 minutes, you're going to generate more revenue per minute of constrained resource, that is the claim supervisor, than if you take $12.50 and divide it by 3.2, which is the unit load with regard to claim supervisors for hospital claims. Let me see if I can type that here and explain that. It turns out to be I can generate $4.54 per minute of claim supervisor time for the physician's claims. Alternatively, the hospital claims will generate $12.5 divided by 3.2 minutes of claim supervisor time, only $3.9. And that's why in this particular case, if we have the chance, or if we have the choice, as it were, we would stick to the physician's claims. So here's the big aha about this. If we understand what is determining our process capacity, what our constrained resource is, then we can use that to drive or at least educate product mix decisions. In other words, let's favor products that make the best use of our constrained resource, the thing that determines our process capacity. Okay, other question, what would be the theoretical capacity if the service mix was 50-50? Well, it's probably going to be somewhere between 4,687 and 5,454, what we had before. So let's just see, if we split the baby, we get something like this, and it turns out to be 5,000. Now, something we could play with here, of course, is what's going to happen to the system if we add a mail clerk, let's say. If we add a mailroom clerk, what do you think is going to happen to the answer? Are we going to be able to generate more theoretical revenue? Well, look what happens. If we add a second mailroom clerk, all that happens is the utilization of the resource pool goes down. It doesn't do anything because we haven't addressed the constraint. If we want to increase the capacity of this process, then we need to do something here with claim supervisors. If we add a sixth claim supervisor, Now we should see a difference in the theoretical revenue. And in fact, we do. It goes up to $6,000. Let's say we add 4 more claim supervisors to bring the number up to 10. What do you think is going to happen here? Well, look what happens. Now if we have 10 claim supervisors, we have so much capacity now in this particular resource pool that the constraint has shifted. In fact, it's shifted to the mailroom clerk. And that's what typically happens in systems like this. There's always going to be at least one constraint that's going to define the process capacity. And you can see it here. So continuing with this topic, let's look at an interesting example here. Resource pools at a hair salon. And again, I borrowed this example from the Managing Business Process Flows book by Anupindi et al. Here's the situation. We have 3 hairstylists that run a hair salon. They stay open from 6:45 a.m. to 9 p.m. Gosh, I don't want to be the person getting my hair cut at 8:50 p.m. But anyway, let's assume they are hardworking hairstylists. On average, it takes 10 minutes to shampoo, 15 minutes to style, and 5 minutes to bill the customer. A receptionist handles check-in, which is 3 minutes. So if we look at the process flow, we receive the customer, we shampoo their hair, we style it, and we bill it. More interestingly, from our standpoint, is we've got 2 resource pools. We've got the resource pool of hairstylists, which consists of 3 individuals, and we got the resource pool of the receptionist, which consists of 1 individual. Furthermore, they have different unit loads for every customer coming in. So the questions I have is, first, what is the number of customers that can be serviced per hour in the hair salon? Secondly, suppose the receptionist is reassigned to do the billing. How will this affect the theoretical capacity of the process? What I want you to do is take about 20 minutes or so to solve this problem. And you can use the New Life example as a pattern for doing this. Some things to recognize here. First of all, besides the fact we have 2 resource pools, each customer that comes in requires 33 minutes worth of work. 30 minutes of that is on 1 resource pool, the hairstylist. The other 3 minutes is on the receptionist. So once you've done your analysis, come back and we'll answer the 2 questions here. Okay, here's what I got. I have 2 resource pools, stylist, receptionist, each of which has each unit there works for 855 minutes per day. So in the case of the stylist, you have total available minutes per day of 2,565 minutes. We have 1 receptionist working from 6:45 to 9 p.m. So they're available for 855 minutes per day. And their unit load is 3 minutes, while the unit load for the stylist is 30 minutes. So if we take the available minutes per day for each resource pool and we divide that by the unit load per customer, we get the theoretical capacity of the resource pool. And the way to look at this is, in theory, if the stylists are busy 100% of the time, they could handle 85.5 customers on average. The receptionist, in theory, could handle up to 285. So realistically, the receptionist is going to be woefully underutilized in comparison to the stylist. If we were to, in fact, handle 85.5 customers per day, the stylist would be busy 100% of the time and the receptionist only 30% of the time. Now, if we go back to what our question is, what is the number of customers that can be serviced per hour in the hair salon? Well, we can go back to the spreadsheet, and if we can do 85.5 per day, we got to figure we're open for what? 14.25 hours per day, and it's a simple matter of doing some algebra, some simple division there. The more interesting question is the second one. That is, suppose the receptionist is reassigned to do billing. How will this affect the theoretical capacity of the process? Well, if the receptionist is doing billing, what that means is we're going to take 5 minutes out of the time, the unit load on the stylist, and move it over to the receptionist. So using the spreadsheet, it's pretty quick analysis here. We drop the unit load on the stylist by 5 minutes, and we add 8 minutes to the receptionist. Now, if you look at that, it looks better balanced, right? More importantly than the balance here is that it's increased the theoretical capacity of the resource pool up to 102. So let's say before they were handling 70 customers per day. Well, the stylist were going to be busy in an inordinate percentage of the time, while the receptionist was going to be relatively underutilized. Now, if I have 70 customers coming in per day, both the stylist and the receptionist are getting breaks. So this is an example of how we can shift the workload around a little bit to try to strike a better balance across the resources and maybe in some cases increase the theoretical capacity and hence the revenue generated by the business process. So here's what I want you to do on your own. Go back to the New Life spreadsheet we looked at earlier and answer each of these questions starting from the initial problem conditions as shown in the spreadsheet. So that is 100% physicians as the unit load. I want you to first increase the number of claims processors from 12 to 14. What is the impact on the available minutes per day, on theoretical process capacity? What are the implications of this? Now remember, if the claims processors are not the constraint, what do you think is going to happen? Second, going back to the initial conditions, suppose New Life invests in information technologies that allow a claims supervisor to process any claim in just 2 minutes. What is the impact on theoretical process capacity? Now, since the claims supervisors are the constraint, this could definitely have an impact on process capacity. Third, assume New Life is experiencing an actual demand of just 400 claims per day. What is the utilization level for the claims supervisors? If demand is expected to remain at 400, is there any benefit in New Life adding new resources or shuffling the resource pools? Why or why not? Now I'm starting to get you to think about the implications for queuing theory. I may have a resource that's utilized 95% of the time, so technically it may not be the constraint, but any resource that's utilized that high is likely to have large queues in front of it if we have variability in arrivals and service times. Some additional questions. If 3 claims processors quit, is there a problem? 5, what would be the impact on the process's theoretical capacity if New Life eliminated the claims supervisor's step altogether? That is, they redesigned the business so we don't have to do this. And what are the business implications of doing it? Finally, suppose a physician's claims and hospital claims both take 2.2 minutes. Under these conditions, what is the optimum product mix? And what do we mean by optimum here? My point of having you go through these questions on your own is it'll give you time to practice with the spreadsheet, but more importantly, understand the relationship between resource pool capacity, process capacity, and the implications on changing unit loads. So with this background, we're now ready to talk about the theory of constraints formally. Workflow flows through a system like water through a pipe. So if we think about the analogy here, which step determines the amount of water that can get through? Clearly, it's going to be step C in this process. Now the question then becomes, what value is it to improve the capability, i.e. the capacity, of any of the other operations? For instance, if we go through some effort to improve the productivity of step A, so in effect we get greater capacity, what's the implication for the entire process or system? It's not going to have any implication because we're going to be constrained by the amount of water that can get through C. C is the constraint. So taking a closer look at constraints. Constraints are anything that limit an organization's throughput. When we talked about the New Life example, we talked about resource pools, but it could be process steps, but either a resource pool or a process step with limited capacity can act as a constraint. But in addition, constraints can be rules or procedures that actually limit throughput. For example, do we print out customer orders before processing when we could do it electronically? Do we batch work up when we don't need to? Those are examples of rules that aren't necessarily related to capacity, but can constrain throughput. As we saw in the case of Newfield, the constraint dictates the system throughput, and every system has at least one constraint, and That's important because if we recognize that each process is going to have at least one constraint, then we can choose to manage it, position it where we want it to be, or we can be the victim of the constraint popping up wherever it wants to. If we know where the constraint is, focusing attention on it simplifies the life of the manager. Let me give you an example, couple examples of how we can manage the constraint to our advantage. Suppose I have a fairly complex process flow here. We have work coming in here, goes out to 3 different types of branches and so on. And you can also imagine this being some kind of complex queuing system with multi-servers, multi-phases, etc. Now, what if we position the constraint at the beginning of the process? That is, for right now, for this back half of the lecture, I'm going to assume resource pools and activities are one and the same, just to keep it simple. But suppose we position the constraint at the beginning of the process. So this particular step here has less capacity than any other downstream process. So by definition, any work that's flowing out of here is going to be less than the theoretical capacities of any of the downstream processes. So as a result, we in effect control the flow of work to the downstream processes, and we're protecting them against surges. Examples are reservation systems. We limit the number of units that can flow into the restaurant, i.e. the customers who can flow into the restaurant. Therefore, we don't overwhelm our resources. You can think of another example, people on an airplane, besides, I don't know, people in a ballpark. Okay, now that was an example of where we put the constraint at the beginning. But in manufacturing, oftentimes you'll see the constraint at the end of the process. And the constraint is then used to control the timing and the flow of all upstream activities. For example, we might have a paste assembly line that dictates the flow of the upstream steps. This assembly line, let's say, can make 1,000 units per day. So since it can only make 1,000 units per day, every other process here has to make sure that it controls its operational level to 1,000 units per day. So even if the theoretical capacity of this particular step is 2,000, it's not going to be able to output more than 1,000 per day. Otherwise, you're going to start seeing inventory build up in the system. So again, walking through the example here, positioning the constraint at the end of the process means upstream process steps have to work at a set pace to avoid building large queues of work within the process. And in fact, this is very common in paste assembly and just-in-time types of manufacturing environments. Kanban is one signal mechanism that we talk about in advanced planning control classes that is used to time the flow and control the level of flow between links. But in either case, whether we position a constraint at the beginning of the process or we position it at the end of the process, the same idea holds. We know where the constraint is and we manage it to be where we want it to be. Now, that said, let me talk about external versus internal constraints. The system constraint can be external to the organization. It might be supplier limitations. It might be limited market demand. In some cases, this is good. We want the constraint to be external. If you're an emergency response team, you don't want the constraint to be the number of fire trucks and personnel you have. You want the constraint on number of fires fought to be the demand from the outside. In other words, you don't want to see your internal processes overutilized. Now, alternatively, if the system constraint isn't external to our organization, then it has to be internal. And it's going to be some limited internal resource, people, machines, etc. Or as we talked about earlier, it could be some set of rules or procedures we follow. An internal step can still be problematic if it isn't a constraint. Now, let me give you an idea of what I mean by this. Suppose I'm in a business and I have a resource, I have an activity that is 90% utilized. So even though the demand is less than what the resource can handle. If I'm at 90% utilization, that can be problematic because, again, what? Queuing theory. When we start getting the higher levels of utilization, if there's any variability in arrivals and service rates, queues will start to build up, time in the system will start to grow. Now, let's dig into the theory of constraints and how it has some practical ramifications for managers. The first myth is that improving any part improves the whole, and this has been going on for years in management. The idea that some kind of improvement effort will be launched in the organization and everyone is sent off to work in a particular area and improve whatever it is they're responsible for. So each division, each department, each sub-process, they're treated as separate entities and they get rewards for making improvements within their particular area. The reality is that business flows cross multiple areas. So the process steps are linked, often cases, in the same logical chain. The constraint determines the throughput of the entire process. So if we spend our time implementing improvements in all different areas of the business, in a lot of the cases, it's not going to make any difference to throughput because all we're going to be doing is improving the flow through a non-constrained area. It's not going to affect the overall process. And the results of not focusing on the constraints means initiative overload, unsynchronized performance, and in some cases changes in one place causing problems in another place. Let me give you an example of this. Suppose you have a manufacturing plant where the assembly area is capable of putting out 2,000 units a day and the painting area can do 3,000 units a day. What is the point of trying to improve the throughput rate for the paint area? It's not going to buy you anything. Maybe some additional downtime in the paint area, but for the most part, if you expect to see more revenue come out of the plant, then you're going to have to expand the assembly area capacity. So you might as well focus your attention on where it's going to have the best impact. Now, what do I mean about changes in one place causing problems in another? Well, let me get my pen here and show you what I mean by this. Let's say I have one area and this box represents its capacity and it's feeding another area whose capacity is represented by this box. So in this particular case, I have work flowing through like that. And maybe the constraint is, we'll say maybe this is the constraint right here. And I expand capacity in this constrained area without thinking about the impact down here. What happens if I bring the capacity up to here? Well, all of a sudden this area is getting more workflow than anticipated. Utilization levels can go up and performance within this part of the process can hurt. So all I'm trying to point out is the idea that if we don't understand where our constraint is and we don't understand what the impact is of changing it or changing a non-constraint, then we're going to have problems somewhere else that are unanticipated. Okay, a myth. Extra capacity is wasted capacity. So the traditional approach in business has been to size capacity at each process step to expected volume of work and no more. That's fine if there's absolutely no variability in arrivals and no variability in service times. The reality is that trying to quote unquote balance capacity means any process step could become the constraint due to normal variability. So imagine we have a process with 3 steps. Okay. And under normal steady state conditions, let's say each of these is utilized at 90%. So we could predict how big the queue would be in front of these, and we could predict the flow times and all that kind of stuff, doing some basic analysis. Now what, under this particular situation right here, these are utilized at 90%, so demand must be somewhere below the capacity levels of each process step, but not much. Now what if there's a slight blip in the service rates? So in other words, the service rate slows down. For the same demand level, then if the service rate slows down slightly, maybe the utilization goes up to 95%. All of a sudden, the queue goes from this size to much larger, we can't anticipate that kind of impact. In other words, the system seems very nervous. Likewise, if the demand goes up slightly, all of a sudden the utilizations could go up just slightly from 90 to 95%. But as we saw in the case of queuing theory, slight increases in utilization when we're running at high levels already can throw the system out of whack. So what are the results? Well, if we try to balance capacity too closely, we can have shifting constraints that we can't anticipate. Because of that, we can have missed due dates. Suddenly performance goes wild. If performance goes wild enough, people are going to start padding their schedules. They're going to do constant rescheduling and build up inventory in the system to protect themselves. And in effect, you get a chaotic, fat system. This leads then to the notion of protective capacity. The idea here is an important one. If capacity is balanced too closely across process steps, the natural variability in arrivals, service rates, or even product mix can cause a constraint to jump around. This is especially problematic in high variability environments, including a lot of service environments in which the customer is directly involved. It's less so for operations that can limit arrival and service time variability. This is why, in general, manufacturing operations can run at higher levels of utilization than service environments. So what's the solution? The solution is to add enough protective capacity to non-constrained resources so that they are not in danger of becoming the constraint. So what that would mean is something like this. Let's go back to our queuing theory. And let's say this line represents utilization. What we saw is as utilization starts to approach 100%, whatever measure of queue performance we were talking about, whether it's time in the system, number in the system, etc., the performance will really start to degrade very quickly. Okay? So the idea being is rather than trying to run at this level of utilization and risk having performance go from here to here if something goes wrong, because that represents only a slight increase in utilization, why don't we try to keep our utilization level down at a lower target? That way, if we have some swing due to variability, we don't see as much impact on the underlying measure performance. So again, I have an x-axis here being utilization of some process, and maybe this y-axis is some measure of queue performance. I'm going to call that QP right here, just to remind myself. Once again, I will always encourage better handwriting for you than for me, but that's the way it goes. So think about that concept a little bit. It becomes very important in things like healthcare services. Emergency rooms, don't try to run at 80% utilization because a slight increase in demand could really throw them off. On the other hand, in less non-critical types of service environments where there's not as much variability, maybe you can get by with a higher level of utilization. So what are the steps to managing the constraint? Well, the first thing is we have to understand where the constraint is. And that often takes a little bit of analysis, but generally speaking, if you're in a business and there's one area where the work's always backed up, that its output seems to always match the output for the entire system, you probably have the constraint. The second thing is to exploit the constraint. And what I mean is remove any barriers that keep the constraint from working its best. In some cases, that would mean changing work rules, making sure the constraint always has something to do so it's not underutilized even for short periods of time due to some variability. Third, subordinate all else to step 2. Now this is a very important idea here. The argument is if we're worried about managing process capacity and throughput, then we need to focus our attention on the constraint, not the other extraneous areas. If desired, if we want to elevate the process capacity, then we need to elevate the constraint, i.e. get more of it. Now, if we add more capacity to a constraint, then that implies something else is going to pop up. So we have to go back to step one and identify the constraints again. Now, once you look at these 5 steps, you realize we did all of this when we did the new life example. We identified the constraints, and it turned out to be the claims supervisor. To exploit that constraint, we would make sure that the claims supervisors were always busy, or at least weren't starved for work. If desired, we could have added more claims supervisors to increase the overall capacity of the process. But when we did that, there's a possibility that one of the other resource pools would then become the new constraint. The impact on strategy of the theory of constraints. First, management can determine where they want that constraint to be, and they can develop an operations plan around it. This is called managing the constraint. Again, a classic example is a reservation system where you use the reservation process to manage inputs to the downstream activities. Alternatively, paced final assembly, where the assembly line dictates the amount of work coming from upstream processes. Those are all examples of managing the constraint. Second, if possible, marketing and sales should be tied to the constraint through the exploit step. For an example, can we sell more services that do not use a constraint or make better use of it? We've already seen this example. Remember the New Life example where we talked about physicians' claims and hospital claims. If I was working for New Life, then I would encourage the marketing and sales folks to go after physicians' claims versus hospital claims, given the fact the physicians' claims generate more revenue based on their use of the constrained resource, which in that case was the claims supervisors. That's an example of exploiting the constraint. So to summarize, all processes have at least one constraint, and by processes I mean everything from supply chains all the way down to a simple set of activities. The constraint dictates system throughput. The constraint can be internal or external to the business. If we are talking about an environment where we have steady state conditions, in other words, we're really saying the flow rate into the system matches the flow rate out, then usually we're talking about a situation where the constraint is external. Demand is a constraint and not my own internal capacity. We can proactively manage the constraint, and we should consider buffering the constraint to protect throughput when possible, and use protective capacity at non-constraints just to ensure that they don't become constraints due to unforeseen variability.